that's for Richard Pito, if Richard comes this afternoon or not. But that's Richard. But next to Richard, if only he's here, is Professor Rory Milne, who is the head of NIH Evaluation Trials and Studies Coordinating Centre. Then next to him is Professor John Took, who's president of the Academy of Medical Sciences, which has had a few name checks already this morning.
Sorry, Gala.
And is Vice Provost for Health at University College London, which is in which we are a part of here. And indeed, next to John is Professor Ross Smith, who is director of this wonderful institution that we are in today. Ross, thank you very much for letting us be here. And then finally, at the very end, on the far left, is Professor Jeremy Pearson, who's the Associate Medical Director for Research at the British Heart Foundation. Now, what we're going to do this is that we're going to give each of them 5 minutes or so to make some reflections on either what they've heard today, or, if they haven't been able to be here for every part of the meeting, what they've read, because they have read the papers assiduously, and then we're going to open it up for some discussion. But the focus now is, you've heard about the problems, the focus now is on action and what we can do about what we've heard. So I'm going to start off with you, Rory.
Thank you, Richard. I'm Rory Milne from the NIHR. To reiterate what Peter Knight said earlier, the first thing to say from the perspective of the NIHR is that this Lancet series is really important and great. The NIHR, set up in 2006 as a health research system with the vision of improving the health and wealth of the nation through research. The research it funds is distinctive. It's clinical, applied, and mostly pragmatic. It's about aiming to help NHS decision makers and to benefit patients. The NIHR is often described as the research arm of the NHS in England. As such, it spends £1 billion a year, a lot of money, but remember, that's less than 10% of the total amount spent in health research in the UK per annum. Industry accounts for at least 2/3. So the challenge for all of us who work in the NIHR is to make sure that that billion achieves more for patients and the public than it would have had it been spent on direct patient care. That is a big challenge. Everything the NIHR does is aimed at adding value to the NHS and at helping to improve care for and outcomes of patients, both through research we fund directly and through wider research that we support. But we cannot be complacent, we must do better. So that's why when Iain and Paul's paper was first published in 2009, we welcomed it with open arms. It provided a way of thinking about value in health research that chimed with NIHR's vision, and that is systematic, balanced, accessible, but also challenging. Since then, we've done quite a lot of work to refocus and enhance NIHR's work to make a difference to the NHS. The new series takes forward the 2009 paper, as we've heard, in several ways. It updates it, it extends it with a brand new pillar, the third element on research, regulation, governance and management. It goes far beyond trials, which was the focus of the original paper, important that they are, and of course it's underpinned with a huge amount of empirical evidence in encyclopedic quantities. That's an awful lot of references. So we're going to need to work through the detailed recommendations over the coming months with stakeholders, but overall this is great. So just briefly to highlight a few points from the 5 papers. Number 1, setting research priorities. Ensuring that the NIHR funds research that matters, that addresses questions that matter, is crucial, and different parts of the NIHR system tackle this in different ways. Mention's been made of the James Lind Alliance and its priority-setting partnerships, and I'm really pleased that the JLA moved formally under the banner of the NIHR last spring. 2, design, conduct and analysis. The NIHR is committed to excellent research at all times, and the paper is full of interesting ideas. It makes reference to Prospero, the prospective register of systematic reviews that the NIHR established recently. I thought the analysis in that paper of workforce issues, incentives, rewards, and the issue of reproducibility were all really interesting and important and worth coming back to. Regulation, governance and management. So this is the brand new part of the framework since 2009, and it's an area where the NIHR, and particularly through the clinical research networks, has put a lot of effort working with the Health Research Authority. Justice delayed is justice denied. Research delayed is potential patient benefit delayed. At the same time, we need to put a spotlight on the responsibility of researchers to deliver research expeditiously and efficiently. Inaccessible research, hugely topical, major report in this country only a couple of days ago from Parliament, and of all the 5 areas, in a way this feels like it ought to be the most straightforward to crack. But although we've put a lot of effort in the NIHR into increasing publication rates, using a variety of approaches, we have a lot further to go. Incomplete and unusable reports, the final paper. Very thoughtful analysis. There's clearly a big challenge in finding proportionate methods to ensuring that reporting is complete, linked and usable, and that it meets the appropriate needs of different audiences, a point touched on but I can't quite get my head around. The specialist audiences, researchers, generalist professionals, non-professional audiences. But that's the direction we have to go in. So from my perspective, one of the striking common themes across the papers was the observation that we're dealing with a number of complex and overlapping complex ecosystems, each of which has evolved with its own distinct set of purposes: pursuing science, making profit, developing careers, producing knowledge, and so on. And even in England, these ecosystems involve a multiplicity of funders, private, public, charitable, thousands of researchers, hundreds of departments, dozens of universities, many regulators, and countless journals. Each pursues their own goals with their own assessments of risks and opportunities. The issue then, from the perspective of the NIHR and the NHS, is what rewards, regulations and structural changes are needed to increase the return on investment, to refocus those ecosystems towards producing knowledge that will deliver maximum value for future patients. Which brings me back to the A word, accountability. For all applied research that's funded by the public, and for the NIHR in particular, we have to do the very best we can. For those patients or persons, Jack, who have participated in the research, and for future patients. This series gives us the ideas and I think some of the tools for making even more of research funds and for accounting for what we do in the future. And so for bringing us this series, we're indebted to the international and distinguished list of 44 authors, of 5 papers, 2 comment pieces, and of course, to the Lancet.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Rory. Now, I forgot to mention that Marco has stepped out of his ski gear and has joined us, abandoned his tie, and is with us on screen live. So I just wanted to recognise Malcolm's presence. Malcolm, howdy. Can we hear you?
You can take me off the screen if you like.
No. It's good. If we see you supping at some alcoholic beverage wherever you are, much better than be embarrassing like that than not see. So you're with us. John, you're speaking both as President of the Academy of Medical Sciences, our premier institution in biomedicine in the United Kingdom, and also as a leader of health research at our premier university in the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you for that accolade, Richard, and for the opportunity. Like Rory, I clearly think that this is an incredibly important agenda. The Academy of Medical Sciences exists to promote medical science excellence for the benefit of society, so I think you can see how central this agenda is to us. I missed all the presentations, but I have read the publications, which I must say I find timely, challenging and appropriate. So thank you very much for those. It's clear that the value of science, what science offers, what medical science offers, will be seriously undermined unless we retain the confidence of society, who are, of course, largely the funders in one form or another. in what is produced in the name of medical science. So this couldn't be a more important agenda. I've got some specific comments to make about the process of science and the particular responsibilities those that belong to this overlapping complex ecosystem have. But before I make those, I just want to put the medical scientific endeavour in a slightly larger context. I know that may make the situation even more complicated, but I think it is important to realise that this is part of a larger whole. The fundamental stimulus to most people in this room, I suspect, most people who take part in medical science, health science, is what drives them is what they can contribute to health gain. That's even true of the most basic scientists for the majority of them. They want to see the results of their endeavour result in some advance in health in the longer term. And of course, more recently, there's been an emphasis on the economic gain that can come from engagement in the life sciences, either through the monetisation of new developments or a more productive, healthier society. So these are fundamental issues for society. Now, the challenge that underlies all of this is the fact that medical innovation as currently constructed, of which medical science is a significant part, is unsustainable. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the cost of development of new products and new technologies, the escalating costs of health services in developed systems around the world, then clearly we're entering an unsustainable period. And we know from economic analyses that the major driver to that unsustainability is the adoption and diffusion of treatments that are of marginal incremental benefit over those that exist already. So actually it's the doctors in this room that are playing a large part in that. We're not playing our part in replacing effectively treatments that are less effective. Now, if you look at medical science in that context, I think it's clear that you can only begin to approach this if you look holistically, look at this complex ecosystem in even a larger sense, and realise that the process of innovation firstly begins with recognising there is a health need to address. So it starts and indeed ends with a patient or a citizen. Secondly, there's the issue as to whether the research question that health need raises is a tractable one at this point in time with current scientific knowledge. That clearly often requires a deeper understanding of the basic mechanisms before there is any chance of making that issue tractable, and hence the long lead time for some developments before they realise clinical benefit. There's an acceptance that we need earlier proof of concept of potential solutions such that huge amounts of money aren't wasted on pursuing ideas which will never come to fruition. There needs to be an earlier conception of what value or incremental value represents, rather than leaving that to the end of the process when commissioners decide whether something is actually going to add. We need slicker regulation to get through the process more effectively to meet unmet need, particularly for patients in dire circumstances where there are few treatments on offer. And then finally, we need better adoption, better diffusion of those things that are known to work, and ultimately better adherence if those treatments are truly meeting the health needs that are first expressed. Now, in couching things in that sense, I must declare an interest. UCL, together with Oxford University, have created something called a Centre for the Advancement of Sustainable Medical Innovation. But the reason I raise it in this context is that to address those issues, Yes, of course, we need better conventional medical science. We need better discovery, better proof of concept, better trials and their conduct. But we also need understanding of the way that human behaviour, organisational behaviour, ethics, law, etc. impinge on that innovation system. To not mention the economics of innovation, which is clearly a very important part of this. So I just wanted to couch the medical science responsibilities in that slightly broader context, and we won't address some of the problems that I'm sure you've been discussing this morning unless we pull on academic disciplines out with our conventional view of what medical science is. Now, none of this, of course, denies that medical science and those that support it have major responsibilities to ensure that we do it in the most effective and efficient way to get the best return on investment for the benefit of society. So let me just underscore a few points that resonated with me as I read the papers. Firstly, around the process of research, there is this huge issue of reproducibility, which has been recently highlighted in other fora. Of course, it's undermined by the pressure for publication, which means that in certain circumstances the controls, the repeats of experiments aren't conducted to ensure the level of reproducibility. Of course, at worst, poor reproducibility is actually down to fraud, but in most instances I suspect it's down to sloppiness in terms of research methods, inadequate sample sizes, poorly described methodology, which therefore becomes irreproducible. To signal, I think, the importance of this agenda, the Academy of Medical Sciences is currently exploring with the Institute of Medicine whether we're going to undertake a major international piece of work exploring the dimensions of reproducibility such that we can contribute to that debate. Of course, it would be eased if greater emphasis was placed on appropriate, adequate reporting of methods, for example, and using replicability as a measure of quality of research outputs. Now, this whole issue of reproducibility, I think, becomes more important when we consider the drive to secure interdisciplinary work. I think most academic health organisations would realise that a lot of advance now stems at the interfaces between conventional disciplines, and so interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is being encouraged. It does come with a risk, and the risk is, of course, if you relate to somebody working in another discipline, you're inevitably doing so because you're not an expert in that discipline and therefore don't know the methodological limits. And therefore we have to be very conscious of the risks posed by this move of interdisciplinarity, something of which I have to say I'm a great fan. This will, I think, become even more extreme when you move away from hypothesis-driven research to research which is dependent on the analysis of, for example, big data sets, where there will be few in this room equipped to understand the algorithms that are used to synthesize those data, which will, for the large part, need to be taken on trust. So you can see descriptions of those algorithms, the way that information is used, will become increasingly important to give society the assurance that this black box that's being interrogated is being done so appropriately. Third, the issue of prioritising research, and I deliberately began my comments on medical innovation starting with the patient perspective of health need and finishing with the question of adherence, which pulls adoption of new treatments as appropriate. So I'm a profound believer in engaging appropriately with citizens, with patients, to understand what matters to them. Now, that doesn't come from a political stance, that comes from personal experience. So, for example, when I was a very active physician, I can remember treating people with Parkinson's disease, and at face value, if you're somebody with Parkinson's disease in front of you, you think, well, this tremor must be pretty disconcerting. Actually, what matters to people with Parkinson's disease, by and large, is the bradykinesia, the difficulty of initiating movement. That's not obvious to somebody who hasn't got Parkinson's disease. By the same token, I'm a diabetologist, so somebody in their wisdom in the mid-part of the last century decided it would be a good idea to make insulin long-acting, so that the poor patient could avoid having to inject themselves 3 or 4 times a day before each meal. The net result of that humane move in the interests of patients was a legacy of 30 to 40 years of unpredictable hypoglycemia, poor glycemic control, and having to eat rigidly to keep up with this bolus of insulin that you had on board. It was a surprise to me as a diabetologist in the late 70s when people chose to go back onto regular injections of soluble insulin, suffering this discomfort of multiple injections, which doctors perceived as a problem. But for patients, what was far more relevant was the loss of control, loss of self-control that hypoglycemia implied, or the need to be unusual and stick to a rigid mealtime regime. So I spell out this story just to illustrate that it's very easy, even for a thinking, caring doctor, to misinterpret what actually matters to the person with the condition. So close attention to that in terms of prioritising what we research is important. Fourth, I think penultimate point, nearly penultimate point, valuing research effort. And that's a collective responsibility of funders, government agencies, ranking agencies, etc. I would simply make the point that in terms of what value we attach to, say, basic science as opposed to applied science, I think we actually have to use different yardsticks. It might seem a rather strange thing to say, but if we demand that fundamental science results in impact, well, you'll be doing a retrospective analysis that might take 25, 30 years. What I think the yardstick we should use for fundamental science is that it really is a conceptual advance, and it really is rigorously first-class, methodologically first-class, replicable research. Of course, we want that for applied health research as well, but I think we also need to demand evidence that it is impacting early on. And so it's looking at those two ends of the spectrum through that particular lens. Universities, academic health science systems, I think, have a particular responsibility in this area. Not only must we attend to the impact agenda, but we also need to take account of how we consider promotion criteria, for example, of our staff. We also need to balance the endeavour across the translational spectrum. There is a great pressure in periods of fiscal constraint to concentrate on the more impactful end of science, but we, as Paul Nurse would put it, we deny basic science the seed corn that ultimately results in scientific advance, I think, at our peril. And it will never be a one-to-one relationship between fundamental science and applied science. If it is, we're not taking sufficient risk over the fundamental avenues that we go down. So there's a balance to be struck there about how much risk you want to take, how blue skies you want to be. I'll just tell the anecdote of the Wellcome Trust's experience in this area, where in the late 90s they started a scheme which basically funded to the level of then project grant funding to support research that was characterised as being the wackiest idea that you'd ever had, you could never get funded. And then they looked at the output, pound for pound, from those projects compared to conventional project grants. And the impact from the high-risk projects in terms of conventional academic metrics or patents or other social impact was far greater. So in other words, even an entrepreneurial funder such as the Wellcome Trust, there's a tendency to be risk averse in funding approaches. And that is my final point, that I think risk averseness is the enemy, or one of the enemies of innovation. That plays through clearly in the research field in terms of the regulatory environment, where clearly we need regulation, but we need true proportionality. It can play through, as one of the publications made clear, in terms of funding strategies, tending to fund certainty. It certainly plays through in the academic environment, where you're encouraged to have the results before you apply for the grant, to give evidence that this is actually going to result in something. And that does mitigate against bold imaginative steps which are needed if we're going to make step functions in performance in science. So that risk aspect, I think, needs to be properly considered. But my final point is that in saying all of this, it's not all broken. We do, in the UK, have the most productive health science system in the world, arguably, in terms of what we produce per pound spent on science. But it's clearly beholden on all of us, academics, funders, users of research, determinants of research, that we address all of the legitimate issues that have been raised, because to not do so would really, really damage an important function.
Thank you very much indeed, John. You've given us, I'm very glad actually that you gave us that broader context, because I think unless we have that, then it's hard for us to really take account of some of these social, political and economic forces that are shaping some of the incentives around research decisions. So thank you very much for that. Ros, let's turn to you from your particular perspective, perhaps here as Director of the Institute for Child Health.
Okay, so I'll finish with that perspective. I just want to make some initial observations. So we're all here today because we care about research, about making it more effective, more efficient, and reducing waste. And as my earlier comments indicate, I think I'm very committed to doing that right across the spectrum, from the most basic science through to the most applied. So I'm a cystic fibrosis doctor and researcher, and I was in the States in 1989 when the launch of the discovery of the new discovery of the cystic fibrosis gene was announced, and the three people who led that were very much celebrated as fundamentally important finding. It's taken 24 years since that discovery for the first drug that corrects the defect in 4% of patients with the disease has been licensed, and that was last year. And I'm treating patients with that drug and seeing a dramatic improvement in their symptoms and being able to stop slowly their other conventional therapies. So it's very, very important. But there's a lot of heartache, a lot of redundancy, a lot of agents were showing great promise, and we went after them very enthusiastically, but they haven't made it through to the end of the pipeline. So there is a challenge in making sure that we get the same value for money from research that identifies and understands the biology of disease. If we judge it by the same parameters that we do a randomized trial that takes place in thousands of patients, they're all very important, but we need to recognize and value the contribution of each to the overall improvement in healthcare. So, having said that, there is a lot of practice across the spectrum that needs to be improved. So my first experience of a national funding body assessing competitive national awards was about 15 years ago on a great charity called Action Medical Research. And we looked at some fabulous proposals from people all over the country. And it was only when I started looking at the final reports or the interim reports of those pieces of research that I had led on as a panel member and been enthusiastic about, that it was absolutely devastating to find that either the work had not taken place properly or hadn't taken place sometimes at all because of particular problems, that I became aware that actually we as academics are very good in writing and presenting about what we're going to do, but the follow-through is as important. And so there's been a lot of talk about journals, but also funders, Jeremy, yes. I think have... I'm sorry, you're not going to be looking for... have a responsibility. And many funders are now doing this very well, NIHR, but many others too. They are making very specific requirements of their researchers to present not just final reports, but interim annual reports. And they're held to account by those. So that's a good start. It doesn't get to where we want to be, which is ensuring that there are methodological approaches like, I wouldn't dream of refereeing a clinical trial without reference to consort, or refereeing a grant application for trial without looking at whether or not they were following appropriate methodology. We need to do that across the board for all research, both research into the basic biology as well as clinical research. But it's challenging. It is not trivial because there are many, many different trial designs. So what about people in academia, people who lead groups or institutes or faculties of medicine? What is their responsibility? Well, from a personal perspective, we need to ensure that there are incentives and drivers in place to make sure that studies about the biology of disease translate quickly and effectively into benefits for patients. So in this institute, we have wonderful basic science that has made very important discoveries, but we also have excellent and world-class epidemiology. And we need, and we're talking about this very actively, to make sure that we put those groups of researchers together to generate collaborations that can make these findings benefit, in our case, mainly children, but the adults they become quickly and effectively, and we are very, very committed to doing that. So that then leads on to the next issue, which is that we need to make sure that our incentives and rewards address groups rather than individuals. So we've got to get away from the cult of the great research leader and reward activity that is collaborative, that is interdisciplinary, and that is inter-institutional. And that's the only way we're going to solve these big issues in the 21st century. And I'm very pleased that in the UK, I think we're ahead of the game compared with the US, where I think there is still very much the rewards are focused on the individual rather than the group. And I'd like to get away from this talk about basic science and clinical science. We're all in this together, and I don't think we should try and beat anybody over the head and say that they're not doing as well as we are. We all have really important challenges to overcome. And then the final thing that people in leadership positions need to do is clearly to make sure that within their institution the highest standards of governance are followed, and that research that's conducted gets done. Clearly, sometimes things have to go in a slightly different direction for perfectly valid reasons, but that it gets done to a high standard of excellence in quality and ethical standards, that it gets published. So it is completely indefensible that publicly funded or commercially funded research does not get out into the public domain in a timely fashion. So I'm completely committed to that. But I think that everybody, not just the academic institutions, but the funders, the journals, and the regulators have got that responsibility. And we need to get together, because we know what's happened to clinical research as a result of over-regulation, and Janet talked about that very well this morning. We must avoid the unintended consequences of duplicating the checks and balances at many different levels, so that the poor researcher spends more time defending what they do than they actually spend doing it. So I really would put that out as a health warning. But I think the whole philosophy that has been brought together today is extremely timely, is extremely important, and we all need to work together to achieve it.
Thank you very much indeed, Ross. Now, Jeremy is here representing the British Heart Foundation, and we are extraordinarily fortunate in the United Kingdom having such a diverse and successful charity sector supporting research. There's no other country, I think, in the world that has such a successful charity sector. So you can't speak on behalf of every organisation, but the BHF is the jewel in the crown of that sector. So Jeremy, your reflections.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I've listened with extreme interest to all of today's presentations and discussions, and I apologise for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold, but it doesn't always sound quite like this. And indeed all the challenges that have been set forth by the speakers. And as a research funder, I reflected on those, and I can say that we're tackling some of them better than others, and some of them not at all well. We've got a lot to learn. And I just want to go through some of that and reflect on that from the perspective of us as a funder, and partly as other funders out there. So just to set the scene, we're a publicly funded research charity, as I'm sure you know. So everything we do, we have to collect money from the public to do it. And that has implications as to how we should prioritise what we spend our money on. And the first place where we fall down is that, I think, in that we haven't consulted them in any great detail about how we spend our money. And I will come back to that in a minute. All we know is that when we ask them what we should spend their money on, it's on research. But we haven't asked them what sort of research. So prioritisation of one sort of research against another, we have to drill down further to understand what it is they would really wish to see spent. And that's something we need to take forward over the next year or so. However, at the moment, we fund effectively in response mode. In other words, we don't commission specific pieces of research on specific topics. We don't prioritise things very much. We wait for the research community to come to us with proposals, and then they're peer-reviewed and judged as to whether they should be funded. And I'll come back to how we do that judgment later, because it does cover some of the aspects of what we heard about this morning. We fund the whole spectrum, from discovery research right through to applied clinical research. So, for example, from work on understanding the submolecular organisation of ryanodine receptors in a heart muscle cell, through to understanding the efficacy and cost effectiveness of remote monitoring of patients with heart failure out in the community. So a complete spectrum. How do we judge apples and pears? Well, luckily, because we fund over half the cardiovascular research in the UK, the academic cardiovascular research, we have enough money to be able to fund at both ends of the spectrum. And so far, we've been able to fund the research that we believe, or our panels and our external reviewers believe, is worth funding. So we haven't had that problem yet, but maybe we should think about it harder. How you understand the balance between what should or shouldn't be funded on discovery versus applied research, I think is a very difficult question to answer, and several people already alluded to that. I think from the perspective of us as a funder, we sit amongst other funders, and we have to come to some decisions, if we come to any concrete decisions about that, in consultation with and in knowledge of what other people fund. So that, for example, there's a lot of money within NIHR to fund highly applied direct clinical research. And indeed, increasingly, we fund in partnership clinical trials with NIHR, the HTA or the EMEA program, and we'll go on doing that. But that means that by doing that, there are other people out there that can take care of part of that, so part of what we fund should be more at the preclinical end of the spectrum, or the developmental and translational end of the spectrum, so we have to balance these things. Collaboration versus independence, that came up several times, and how you reward scientists and so forth. I think, as you alluded to, Ros, we're increasingly, as a community in the UK of medical researchers, understanding that we do better and continue to do better if we collaborate. Not just within institutions, but across institutions across the whole of the UK. And I guess as a funder, we've taken some steps to encourage that, although we still fund single institute, single researcher grants. Some of the larger sums of money we release for some of the few, if you like, themed areas of research that we believe will benefit from having an injection of capital, such as regenerative medicine, where we've recently funded 3 centres across the UK. The funding there is given on condition that the centres collaborate with each other, that they network with anybody else out there who's useful to them, they report to us that they're doing so. The plus in return for that is that the money is relatively free. In other words, they can do what they like with it, almost, within some confines, you understand. They don't have to come and say, we want to do clinical trial X with the following detailed protocol, and this is what the answer should or shouldn't be. We give them money to do exploratory research as they wish. So hopefully in that way, a part of our portfolio is encouraging the discovery science and the high-risk science that otherwise grant funding panels tend to discourage. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be equally forceful about when we fund clinical trials, insisting they have the full protocols and all the rest of it. So, but we need to do both, I think is the answer. When we think about the difficulties of incompletely reported data, inaccessible data, and all the rest of it, as a funder, I think we're probably on a par with most of the other major biomedical research funders in the UK. We're okay at it, but not wonderful in what we do to assist and help the process. All of our panels judge applications primarily on the basis of scientific novelty, scientific importance, or clinical importance, if it's a clinical study. Those are paramount. Followed by a detailed understanding of whether the design of the experiment or the trial is adequate to answer the question that's being asked. Followed by also whether the track record of the investigators suggests they're going to be able to do it or not. And that came up earlier in the day. If somebody hasn't published anything on anything for the last 5 years, don't give them any more money, please. And our panel reviewers are very aware of that, so that is an important part of the consideration. Once we have funded research, we both advocate and fund open access publication of the research we fund. And we actually made a condition of the grants we award that research should be published and should be open and accessible. That's not the same as going down the route of publishing complete clinical study reports. We haven't addressed that question yet. It's something that's come up in conversation as a result of today. It's going to come in more conversations, and how we can assist in that process. As to processes whereby protocols are examined at the beginning of a study in more detail and or placed somewhere publicly at the beginning of a study, I think we can contribute to that debate and help it and advocate it. I think it has to be done in collaboration with others. So we, for example, we probably will be in a dialogue with NIHR about whether we should be contributing to the continued maintenance and development of Equator. We've said in the past we approve of Equator. We haven't put any money into it. We haven't really been asked. If we were, we might, but not just us. It's everybody's responsibility. So everybody has to get around a table and agree, I think, to help this process forward, and then we'll be very willing to contribute. I think we could do more to train and educate our review panels in things like the Arrive and Consort guidelines. Some of the individuals on our panels are well conversant with them, others clearly aren't. And I think it might be incumbent upon us over the next year or so to make sure they're all trained appropriately so that they do understand these things better and know more about them. Likewise, we've had a little bit about animal experiments and whether we understand, and we do have quite a number of people who fully understand the 3 R's, NC3R's, idea of reduction, replacement, refinement of animal research, how to do proper power calculations. We demand all those in our grant applications, otherwise the grant goes back. And they have to go and work it out again and satisfy our referees in terms of animal research experiments that these things have been done appropriately. So there is some steps in the right direction, I think, to achieving the levels of responsibility and accountability that we've heard about today, but I think there's a long way to go. And I'd be very interested in being part of this process as it goes on, and I think this has been a great stimulus towards it. Finally, as a basic scientist, one of the few here, thank you, Ros, I think I agree exactly with what Ros said earlier. The basic scientists, if you want to call them that, or discovery scientists, are rather behind on this agenda because it's been driven by the clinical scientists, but they shouldn't be left out of it. They should be encouraged to participate in it and benefit from it, though with the proviso, I think, as both John and Ros have hinted at, the values and the ways of doing that are going to be slightly different than they are from assessing clinical trial outputs and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, give them a big round of applause. No, that's fantastic. We've got a great queue now for discussion. But I'm going to come first because he's been very patient and we can all see him. Malcolm. Now, any immediate reactions? You first author on the overview commentary for the series. Any immediate reactions to what you've heard from our 4 distinguished panelists?
Well, I'm very grateful to them for the reflection. I think things probably are worse than they think they are. And while taking the interest of the VHS access to incidents report or cost, if what all that came from that activity.
We can't hear you too well, Malcolm. Can you hear? Is the internet connection?
Sadly, this morning. Turn the video off, it might be better.
Okay. Can I only turn the video off here so that we can... No, just bear with us. So we're going to do this so that we can give more attention to your voice rather than your face. We love your face. Go, have another go.
So the point was about the British Heart Foundation and that's the other funder and the top 5 universities aiding biomedical research. If you the very simple 4 criteria set out by Lancet in 2012, not one publication from any of those institutions over a 2-year period reported each of those 4 factors. Now I agree that the room to be slightly different, that the research, fundamental research, the measures of success are different. But I think if we're trying to kid ourselves that there's not a major problem with reporting standards and rigor in vehicle research in particular, then we're at risk of being slightly delusional.
Very good. Okay, slightly delusional. At that point, let me open it up to our audience now. We're going to take 2 or 3 comments at a time so that we can get a good batch of questions and then we'll come back to the panel. You can say who you are, where you're from, and the microphone will get to you. Off you go.
Hi, I'm Ed Wilson. I'm a health economist at the University of Cambridge, and my particular interest is in efficient research design. I found the talks today really interesting. There's one aspect I think that could be missing. There's one of the papers deals with what we call technical efficiency in the sense of trying to do your particular research project in the most efficient way that you can without any waste. So regulations aren't overburdened, so sufficient and so on. And there's some work on the prioritisation of what research questions you're going to ask in the first place. But there doesn't seem to be anything on how you actually decide which of those research questions from a variety of, say, clinical trials or other research projects you can do. There seems to be very little on how you can prioritise between those. And I was wondering if the panel had any views on this. And I'm thinking really in terms of this what we call allocative efficiency, in the sense of trying to decide which trials to do, which would maximise the benefit to society from the funds available. So there are techniques available for predicting the health gain from a particular research project, and then comparing that with the cost, and you can rank in that order to then to maximise the predicted return on your investment in research. So are there any thoughts from the panel on that at all?
Very good. We're going to look for a yes, please, lady here. The microphone will magically come to you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy Bishop, Professor of Neuropsychology in Oxford. I'm really quite concerned about incentives, which has cropped up a lot today. But I felt that the 2 of the panelists made comments I found difficult and I think need more reflection. So Jeremy said, of course, we're not going to give any money to somebody who's been having a lot of money and never published anything. But that's not the problem. The problem is that if you do what I did informally to ask a number of my colleagues, if you were to do nothing else but write up all the research you've done, how long would it take you? And the typical answer was about 3 or 4 years. I don't exaggerate, I mean, try it on your colleagues. But the problem is not that people aren't publishing, the problem is that people are chasing research funding all the time, because that's a very strong incentive that they're given by their institutions, the point I made earlier with Malcolm. And people are really not allowing themselves the time to do thoughtful, proper work, because their institutions are leaning on them to get funding in. So that's one issue. And then also, I did feel with Rosalind, she said we should have incentives for groups and not individuals, which sounds fine in principle, but suppose you're a junior person in a group, you leave that group, you go to another institution, unless you have some personal track record, people are actually going to say, well, she, particularly if it's a woman, has worked in this wonderful group, but do we know that she can really do it herself? So I think that's really an extremely difficult issue to realistically implement.
Very good. Let's take the gentleman there, please. Just wave and then.
Jack Dowley is following up Anne's point because I was sitting here thinking of Alan Williams, well-respected health economist, who sort of invented equality in various things, and wondering what he would be making of this occasion. He would note particularly that it's dominated by doctors and clinicians. In fact, there's not an economist, as far as I can see, in 144 authors. Maybe Tom Jefferson? Yeah, I don't know. The problem is that this is all copied. Council of Perfection. I get tweeted about Council of Perfection papers every day. And I read them, this statement, this checklist, and so on. It's wonderful stuff, and I agree completely with it. It's just not part of the real world. And science has to be part of the real world. At the moment, it's in denial. It's in denial about the need to trade off rigour and relevance. And that debate has been well alluded about. We're taking one particular position on it here, and it's delusional. All the efforts about agency and stuff which is being talked about here are part of the real world of people trying to live, get careers and so on. And if you set up these councils of perfection, they're not going to be able to live. That's why the system is broken. The system is broken. It needs a radical change. And the problem is to find the Achilles heel through which I think we would all agree we need to change it. I think we all would agree we need to change it. But you're trying to make it better and better rather than trade off some of the problems in the light of the practicalities of the real world.
Okay, that's a challenge to us. So, have we got the trade-off wrong? Let me start with Rory. We're in denial and we're delusional. This word's come up several times from different dimensions. We need to trade off rigour with relevance. Agree? You do that at MHR? Trade off rigour with relevance?
I think that the challenge posed in the papers, in the 5 papers, is very stark. And if we take it seriously, there is a real problem. The great beauty of the framework that the authors have offered us is it provides a systematic way, but also a piecemeal way in which we can improve things. It says we need to get the prioritisation better, and I'd like to come back to that. We need to get the prioritisation better. We need to publish because otherwise that's research disappeared down the drain. 3, 4, 5 years of work just waiting to be done. The issue of the rigour of methods is, I think, a really interesting and important one, and we should bring in Mike. The papers touched on it, for instance, in relation to systematic reviews. So there is a need for many more systematic reviews, far more than we can currently achieve. The going rate for a systematic review in this country is something between about £20,000 total costs on average for a cheap and simple Cochrane review, through to 200,000+ for the sort of sophisticated evidence syntheses that feed into NICE. That is unaffordable if we want to, if we take seriously the idea of basing new primary research investment decisions on thorough reviews of the evidence and downstream locating the findings in the context of an updated systematic review. But the paper touched on some ideas for that, how you can start to do systematic reviews well, but hugely more cheaply. So you're not talking about 200,000 or even 20,000, but maybe 10 or 5. That's where we have to be going. I think there's probably a very similar challenge that we need to think about in relation to primary research and trials. And I don't know the answer to that, but we cannot keep spending more and more and more. That's clear. We have to make in the world of NIHR that I'm most familiar with, we have to make the the large pragmatic pieces of primary research good enough to provide robust and secure answers, minimise the effective bias ratio, but not all the bells and whistles that people may want.
Okay, Jeremy, I just want to put you on this question of advocacy of efficiency. Can we be more rational in the way we make decisions about awarding grants?
Are you talking about in terms of prioritisation or in terms of...
I think you were talking about it as a prioritisation, yeah?
So selecting which projects to fund, yeah.
Okay. I think part of the answer is what Rory said, that at the clinical end of the spectrum, systematic review is a good way and can be more efficient than it is now at deciding whether the next trial is or isn't worth doing. And I think both NIHR has gone further than anybody else in this respect, but other funders are catching up, that we would expect that kind of review to have been done, or we might even fund that kind of review before we'd even contemplate funding the piece of research that goes on beyond it. We don't actually say that on our website yet, but it might get to that, because I think NIHR is the leader in that respect. In terms of understanding what new piece of research comes forward to fund in the more basic end of the spectrum, I think there you have to rely more upon the fact that the people who are reviewing the grant application are experts in the field and they know what is new out there and what isn't and what is not. And usually they do.
Okay, great. And Ross, I'm going to come to you about this groups versus individuals question. I'm just thinking, can we turn that button? Okay, or maybe Malcolm needs to go back to the slopes. Groups versus individuals, it's a fair point, Dorothy.
Yeah, I mean, we're not where we need to be yet, but we are better than we were. So I think we've moved from the position, certainly with research assessment as it takes place currently and will take place in the REF, from the position where your position in the paper and the impact factor of the journal in which it was published were kind of the determining factors about what the score was, to recognising, so it's been stated quite explicitly that position is not going to be taken into consideration and that it's article level metrics that will be considered, obviously calibrated according to the length of time it's been published for citations. So that's better. It's not as good as we want it to be in terms of rewarding groups, but it is certainly providing a more even playing field that goes away from the great professor getting all of the glory rather than everybody else that's contributed to the work. The issue about more junior researchers is critically important. It exercises me in this institute in a daily basis and trying to encourage the very, very talented scientists that we have who have got fantastic potential to be the professors of the future, whether they're male or female, and most of our young scientists are female, is trying to provide the environment in which they can flourish. And I think all of us in research leadership positions are committed to that. So I hope that it doesn't completely answer your questions, but we're aware of the problems. We've got one or two solutions, but it's very much work in progress.
Can I just add to that in terms of, as a funder, we have personal funding schemes for people at all levels in their career. We wish to encourage the best to get those personal funds, whether they be PhD studentships, junior fellowships, intermediate, senior, whatever, and therefore they do get their personal recognition if they can do that, and we'd like to see as many people as possible achieving that, so that helps.
But I'm slightly worried that funding is treated, getting a lot of money is treated as a better criterion than using that money efficiently and well.
Well, no, let's
I didn't quite say that, but I think
let's
the point.
go to John on that, because these are the incentives that are created by our institutions. So how do you grapple with that here?
Well, let me just make one comment, if I may, Richard, about the group versus individual, because the Academy has been majoring on a piece of work around team science, recognising that interdisciplinary teams are increasingly the norm, and just as we've been describing adverse incentives, or disincentives, or the wrong incentives in relationship to research efficiency, the same issue prevails in terms of team science, because of the value that's attached to the individual performance. Author order, for example, particularly in the medical sciences, can be a particularly pernicious effect. That said, so we need ways of valuing team effort, and interestingly, although industry often comes in for a lot of criticism, in industry they're better geared to recognise team effort in terms of milestone achievement and so on, in terms of producing innovation. That said, productive teams are about productive individuals, so it's not either or. You've got to have systems that value both. And one way of course, valuing an individual is looking at the contribution that they make in terms of team effort, collaborative effort, institutional effort, and recognising that those skills are going to be increasingly important. In terms of the trade-off between chasing research money and publishing all your work, I suspect the problem there largely relies in the fact that you can't, if you knew the output of a research before you started, then why are you doing it? But so you get to the end of a piece of research and you find that it's worthy, but its impact is limited, either in terms of academic impact or socio-economic impact. And therefore the incentive moves, well, I need some more money to do something that will be more impactful this time round. So that I think is the dilemma, and why people will not be motivated to publish the work that needs to be in the public domain, but which doesn't have that cachet of a high impact result. And that's the challenge, or even a negative result, to put it as extreme. Whereas, of course, all of that is, it should almost be a contractual obligation that if you accept the money, there has to be some way of reporting it effectively.
Right.
I mean, I was very interested in An-Wen's analysis, but it stopped at 2005, and PLOS ONE was launched in 2006, and it has a declared aim of publishing, replication studies, and studies that are not, very sound, but not kind of sexy enough to get into the really, what might be regarded as the higher impact journals. And I think, and I'm sure there's debate going on about this at the Lancet, the whole of biomedical publishing is going to be transformed in the next 10 years. I'm quite sure of that. And the internet and the fact that paper journals are going to be a thing of the past, and that a paper appears in this great big database called the internet, and it will be judged on its merit, whatever the mode for getting it out into publication is. So, and I'm hoping that that's going to address a lot of the issues around needing to publish less sexy research.
Right at the top, let's go back to the audience.
Derek Stewart, cancer patient 20 years ago, now involved some person now. I'm involved in the clinical research network 1 day a week. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks to the Lancet and Department of Health. I think we should be commended for holding today's event. I think it's been brilliant to hear this discussion. And I think the only sad thing is there are a lot more members of the public in here. Now, I've skim read the document, and all the recommendations are for bodies and committees and groups. I don't see any recommendations for how we hear the patient voice and public voice, and how we get them involved in addressing this issue of waste and increasing value. So my question to the panel is, what advice would you give to the public to get involved in this debate? Iain's advice was shout loudly, so that's one. So I'm looking for at least 4 others. And then Sarah Buckland from Involved suggested that the next part of it should be, and how could we enforce those organisations and bodies to make sure that the patient voice is heard in their organisations to address this issue. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Other questions? I've got Mike down here. I think it's going to ask the question, Mike. So why don't you say this?
That's more of a comment, and I'd like to just push back a little bit. Number 4, you spoke, which was gone. But, okay. The difference that somehow something delusional about this is that it's somehow more expensive to do better research. Now, it's actually no more expensive to randomise correctly than it is to randomise badly. It's no more expensive to have someone looking at the outcomes in a study who's blind to the exposure than it is to have someone who's not blind. Most of what we were talking about actually would not increase cost. I think the economist from Cambridge, I'm sensitive to your comment that actually there's probably not an economist in the group, and it would have been nice to have one, maybe next time around. But you could hang cost estimates onto a lot of what we've been showing. I mean, I showed you that slide of all the neurosurgical time trials of steroids and head injury. I bet the sum total of those was higher than actually the crash trial costs, which was MRC funded. So you could do that, but the main point I'd just like to make is that actually excellence in research is by no means necessarily more expensive. It might be a bit more expensive to do a larger trial than a bunch of small trials, but I'm not even sure about that.
Okay. Let's go back to the audience for a question. Good, yes. Good, introduce yourself, because we know you, but not everybody might know you.
Yeah, Gerhard from Germany, German Cochrane Center. If we speak about money, I think there's one source which has not been discussed here, and this is the money from rich countries like Germany and Japan and other countries who stay completely out of the process. For example, if you think about funding the Cochrane Corporation, I think the UK funds infrastructure funding 33 entities, something like that. Germany, 0. Korea, 0. Japan, 0. And I think the biggest source of waste and inefficiency is the language barrier between the small part of the world, which is generally English-speaking, 5%, and the rest of the world, 95%, which is completely cut off this process. And what I can say about Germany is that we are very far away from this level of discussion. We haven't even started thinking about it. There's no research on research. So if I complain about it, because there are no figures. All the journals are in English, and our incentives are 100% that an institution would commit suicide if they would not publish everything in English. It's completely based on impact factors, and it's heavy pressure. And I think, so my question to you is all my wish, what can you do to pull these lazy countries into the project?
Thank you very much. So then we go back to the audience. Wave at me if you have a comment or a question. Yes, please. Thank you.
I'm wondering what you mean by research on research and how interdisciplinary you might interpret this, because there are other fields, medical sociology and science and technology studies, that do research on research.
Okay, let's come back to the panel. I want to start with this question eloquently put about the patient voice. because that's a major issue that's come up today in the series, which we haven't fully addressed yet. John?
I'm very grateful to you for raising this. It's been a challenge within my own institution. I've come to recognise that we have tens of people involved in public and patient involvement in research, but they're involved on a topic-by-topic basis. Every research grant virtually we get requires us to have somebody doing this stuff. And so it's non-systematic. There is no career structure for people involved in this type of work. We have to create a framework where they can learn from each other. And as with the rest of this agenda, we actually need to do the research on what works. So we don't know what effective public and patient involvement, we know some things, but we don't know very much about what makes the most effective means of engagement. And again, it's imperative that we use those resources wisely and fully involve people that are engaged in research in the construct of those solutions.
Thank you very much. I know, Ros, I've heard you talk about public-patient involvement passionately in the past. Your reflections on this?
Well, when I was director of MCRN, we made it absolutely fundamental that children, not just their parents, on their behalf, but children and young people would be involved in every aspect of our research process. And that's been a really a fabulous journey. You know, I've changed my perceptions about how I see things.
And that made an impact, didn't it? A big impact.
Yes, and continues to make an impact. And Iain's now quite involved with our children's panel. It's been fantastic. And I think we shouldn't shy away from any group of patients. So children are obviously vulnerable. They are often represented by their parents, but they themselves have a very great perception and understanding of what research involves and can contribute very importantly to studies that they participate in.
Very good, Rory.
Just a couple of points. Patient involvement, patient and public involvement came up for me in several of the papers in the series. It was there in paper 1, patients and the public are among the users of research who those who prioritise research were being enjoined to engage with. It's certainly relevant in relation to design. Study design methods have to be feasible, and patients are very well placed to advise on that. There was a nice paper from the Mental Health Research Network late last year which scored studies in the mental health portfolio for how well they'd done their patient and public involvement. Those that had done better recruited better. It's not terribly surprising, but it was a nice empirical demonstration of that, and so on. So the patient and public involvement at every stage is crucial, but I think there's a bigger issue as well, which I think maybe you were raising in your question, which is how do we engage patients and the public in this bigger accountability challenge around the problems that have been identified. And for me, that has to be part of the overall solution.
Very good. I think, Jeremy, you addressed this point earlier in your remarks.
I held up my hand and said, I said we're not very good at it, and we need to get better. and I think we'd acknowledge that, and I think a lot of what I've heard today will help that.
Okay. So let's now try, just lastly, before we draw this discussion to a close, and Paul and I have a few closing remarks. This question that Gail has raised, which is how do we, which is let me try and reframe it slightly differently, how do we create this into a global movement, so to speak? How do we bring other nations into this conversation so that it becomes not just something local here or even in the United States, but it's something truly international? How do we do that? Who'd like to have a crack at that? John?
Well, I agree it's incredibly important that this is seen as an international agenda. Science is global. We know that many of the highest impact publications derive from interinstitutional, international collaboration, so it must prevail as an international phenomenon. It's why the Academy is hoping to work with the Institute of Medicine in the States to try and signal the international nature of this problem. we also need to work through other agencies. For example, in Europe, the Academy is working very closely with the Federation of European Academies of Medicine, because, as I'm sure all of you know, as a nation state, you don't have much influence in Europe. It's only through European bodies that you really exert that influence. And it's having great influence in terms of things like the clinical trials regulation and hopefully the data protection regulation. But this agenda needs to prevail in that environment as well. So I think we use every avenue.
Can I just pick up? John, originally you started with the point that we can't afford to go on doing all this. We have to reduce waste, otherwise there won't be enough money to do the research at all. That is another big driver, I would have thought, internationally, that can be levered to make it work better.
Yeah.
Any other final reflections at all on this question? Well, come on, yes, you've got some.
Well, I just got a question for you. Is Lancet at all worried that when this is now out in the open, that the next thing will be a piece in the Daily Mail about how we should cut research funding because we're just wasting it?
Yeah, I know. Well, that's part. Thank you for that. That's partly why in my opening remarks this morning, if any of you are here for those, but I wanted to start with a positive statement about the contributions that research has made globally, because I think. I mean, from my perspective, if we don't start from that point of view and the contribution it has made to alleviating human suffering and advancing human health, then that you get to your point. And I was anxious about that wasn't the message that I wanted to get across. I wanted to get to the point of catastrophic failure by route of saying that slightly more positive message. So I absolutely take the point. And I can tell you, last night when I was thinking about what I was going to say over a glass of Lagavulin, that was exactly the thought in my mind about the Daily Mail. So thank you for that. I'm going to give the panel one 10-second chance each to say what one thing you're going to go back and do after this meeting. I'm going to go in reverse order this time. Jeremy, one thing you're going to do after you go back from this meeting.
It's fairly obvious. We've already started an internal discussion about how we better integrate the thoughts of the patients and the public with what we fund. We're going to go on doing more of that as a result of this.
Ross?
I'm going to work even more vigorously to integrate our discovery science with our clinical science for patient benefit.
John?
Well, as you said, I've got 2 roles, so I've allowed 2. So I'm going to go back to UCL and talk to the Vice Provost Research about how we adapt the recommendations of the publications to our whole research process. And I'll talk to the Academy of Medical Sciences about what part we play in prosecuting this agenda beyond reproducibility.
Could it be an item on the Council agenda?
It could indeed.
Okay, very good. And Rory?
Work with colleagues and other stakeholders in the NIHR, and particularly finding ways of working with patients and the public to push forward on these challenges.
Fantastic. Give them a round of applause.